Good afternoon. I am Deirdre Marsh-Girardi from the Sacramento County Office of Education and the project lead for the California Dyslexia Initiative. We are so excited to have so many friends and colleagues from across California, as well as other locations, joining us in this learning opportunity. Welcome to the 2022-23 Expert Webinar Series from CDI. In this year's series, we will learn more about identifying risk factors, setting up effective MTSS RTI school systems to prevent reading difficulties, and delivering research-based instruction to support and remediate struggling learners and students at risk for and with dyslexia. Today, we are excited to feature Dr. Carol Tolman. To support our attendees, we've created a Padlet that will host the slides as well as the webinar companion document that will includes discussion prompts and additional resources to further explore the webinar content with your colleagues. Recordings will be posted on our website about a week after the session. You can access the presentation slides and companion document on the CDI Padlet that's being dropped in the chat right now. Next slide. The Sacramento County Office of Education, SCOE, is the project lead on the California Dyslexia Initiative, CDI. One goal of the CDI is to provide professional learning opportunities within the system of support and across California to build knowledge, skill, and capacity around teaching and supporting struggling learners and students at risk for or with dyslexia. We are delighted to partner with our friends at Glean Education to deliver this expert webinar series. I'm going to hand over, it's my pleasure to turn over the mic over to Jessica Hammond, founder of and CEO of Glean Education, who is leading the coordination efforts for this webinar series. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Deirdre. And thank you, everyone who is here. We are thrilled to partner with SCOE and the California Dyslexia Initiative to coordinate this webinar series for the second year in a row. For those of you who may not know about us, Glean Education partners with schools, districts, and states to deliver online training, school leader consulting, and web-based coaching. Our work aims to build educator understanding of evidence-based literacy practices to improve student literacy outcomes. Next slide, please. This webinar is the 6th in a series of webinars this year on understanding dyslexia within an MTSS framework. If you haven't already registered for them, we'll be putting the registration link in the chat so you can be sure not to miss them. Next slide, please. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carol Tolman. She was awarded a doctorate in educational psychology with a concentration in literacy and has been a consultant at the state, district, and school levels for over 15 years. Prior to earning her doctorate, Dr. Tolman was a classroom teacher and special educator with more than 25 years of experience in public schools at the elementary and secondary levels. She spent 12 of those years designing and implementing innovative, exemplary reading clinic for academically challenged middle and high school students. In addition to spearheading many successful long-term literacy initiatives throughout the country, Dr. Tolman has published Working Smarter, Not Harder, What Teachers of Reading Need to Know and Be Able to Do, and the relationship between teacher knowledge and effective RTI. When we know better, we do better, in IDA's perspectives. Carol is co-author of Letters 3rd edition. She has presided over the Letters Leadership Board, created Letters Online, and provides Letters Trainer of Trainer workshops to prepare others for the rigorous study involved in becoming a certified local Letters trainer. Dr. Tolman has presented internationally in China and Australia and is passionate about the importance of empowering teachers with the knowledge necessary to impact change for all students. Please help me to welcome Dr. Carol Tolman.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Deirdre. And I'm failing miserably at moving the slides forward. I promise I'll do a better job as I work through my presentation. So welcome, everyone. We're from New Hampshire. As the sun goes down here, it's evening, and I know that it's afternoon there. So I will channel your sunshine or your daylight, whatever it is that you have there. Hopefully you're all safe. I know that there's been some interesting weather, so please take good care, and thank you for being here. I appreciate it. So I'd like to jump right in because we have a short amount of time together. And I'll share that everyone has a story. I just want to share a little bit of how I got involved in some of the information and professional development that became letters. For me, it's all about students, as I'm certain it is for many of you. So you might have met, if you know me from before, this gentleman, and his name is Matt. Matt was a student of mine that I met as an 8th grader. And at that time, he was a very angry, very frustrated, actually frequently suspended student from middle school. And I met him as he was entering in high school. At the time, I was working in high school with 9th through 12th graders, trying to help them accommodate and modify what it is that we did in the regular ed curriculum, and then also do some remediation. And Matt we became really good friends because of the information and power of the knowledge that all of you have, and that I will hopefully be sharing to validate what you do and extend what you know as we work through our understanding of structured literacy. So Matt was one of the first students that I ever had to really benefit from the knowledge that I had finally gained. And through my bachelor's and master's work, certainly did not understand that. It wasn't until the doctoral level that I really did. Once I finally had a very solid understanding here, one of my other students in my 13 years experience in the high school level, here, Bree, and you can see I'm so proud of Bree. This is Dr. Bree. Dr. Bree Everard is a Californian, right? She's in Northern California. She is a psychologist and a specialist in autism. And Bree really, as her brothers did, struggled to read, struggled to write, met her yet again as an 8th grader moving into 9th grade. And it has been just a pleasure to see the fruits of our labor, right? When we understand what it is that we need to know and be able to do to impact change for all kids. So it led me on the quest to go from high school to, well, and prison at one point, working with prison inmates, to then go to middle school and then eventually into elementary. Because if I had met Matt and if I had met Bree as a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, we would know exactly to look for and exactly what to do in order to impact change. So that at that level, they did not have to wait and be so frustrated for so long. So with that in mind, my task today is to talk about structured literacy and how it relates to word recognition, always keeping in mind that that's only one aspect or concept, of course, of what we call that simple view of reading. We certainly want to be sure that comprehension is also in our mind. So in preparation for our thoughts and our work together today, please take a moment to the side to jot down, well, your current understanding of what structured literacy really is. What would you consider to be some major characteristics? And how do those characteristics impact perhaps your instruction or instruction that you have seen if you're a coach or an administrator? Just take a moment to reflect, and we'll revisit your thoughts at the end of our time together. And you'll have an opportunity to add to those thoughts as we work through our session here. One of the things that I did in preparation is I was thoughtful of how to best organize this information. So I do have a graphic organizer. I'm going to end the show and just show this to you for just a heartbeat here. A graphic organizer. Woo, this is my messy desktop. Sorry about that. For the characteristics of structured literacy that hopefully you see in the chat here, but we'll walk through those. You can take notes. They're very small spaces. So if you want to elaborate, of course, on those as we walk through, that would make sense as well. But let me pull that back over just for a moment and talk through what it is that we will organize today and how we'll organize our work together. Yeah. Okay, and as we work through, let me just play it in play here. Here we go. As we work through this, what I want to focus on is the what, or the content of what we consider to be structured literacy, and the how, the methodology behind that. I really couldn't talk about the what without the how, nor the how without the what. Because if we understand the content and then understand best how to implement through best practices, then both of those together for both instruction and assessment are extremely helpful. So if I think about that for just a moment, and I'm going to have to stop sharing this for just a heartbeat to adjust one graphic here. There's a lot of information that I had wanted to share, and I want to be sure that you're able to take notes on this. So let me just move this one piece. It's not working the way I want it, so I'll get it right there for you. Okay, great. Here we go. Okay. So there's a lot on this slide, too much, right? A difficult presenter would say, I want to walk through this just briefly, and then we will elaborate each section as we move throughout the day. So we talk about the what, that content. I want to conceptualize that through Possum. If any of you have worked with Marilyn Adams or know of her work with the double deficit hypothesis, or different research that she has done in past work at Tufts University, that's an acronym that she created to stand for the layers of language. So we talk about the layers of language and the quality with which a brain can remember and work with words for reading and spelling at the word recognition phase. So Possum would stand, the P stands for, of course, phonology, or the speech sound system. The O stands for orthography, the letter or the letter patterns, the graphemes that represent those phonemes. The S, one of the S's, would stand for semantics, literally the meaning of the word you're working with. S, the second S, would stand for syntax, or the role, the job that that word would take when it's used within a sentence or within connected text. And the M is morphology. And that morphology refers to the smallest meaningful unit within words. I like to think about this much more practically from a classroom point of view. So I created this chart to say what it looks like and what it doesn't look like when we're considering the what of the, or the characteristics of structured literacy. When I think of layers of language, I would ask children in teaching certain aspects of a word to tell me, what are the sounds in that word? How is that spelled? What do you see for letters? And what are the graphemes, which are the letter and letter patterns that directly represent the phonemes? Asking or talking through and giving instruction on what the word means would also hit on the semantics piece, and using it in a sentence would discuss syntax, right? The role that that would take. And when we talk about morphology, we can layer that into semantics when we talk about roots, prefixes, and or suffixes in appropriate words. What it does not look like is having students try to remember a word by writing it 5 times in rainbow colors on a piece of paper, right? More of a visual approach. So that's a content piece. In addition to that, the way in which we teach this content, the synthetic phonics, is that we take a look at letter sound combinations, and we're attempting to teach through phoneme grapheme analysis. And that's how structured literacy works. It does not work by visually memorizing words, a belief system erroneously that has been driving some of our programs for a while. And I listed this in 2 steps: orthographic mapping, which is appropriate for beginning initial understanding of letter sound combinations, and phoneme awareness when we hook those together. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And then once children really understand the code and have quite a few words automatic or sight words as if by sight, then we want them to learn statistically by being exposed to lots of different books and lots of text. So we'll talk about what that looks like. So what this does look like at the orthographic mapping would be something like, when you're reading a word, look at all the letters and sound it out. If what it is not is look at the first letter, of course, and guess what the word is based on the picture on the page. If we're talking about statistical learning and attempting to expose children widely once they are beyond the early into later and consolidated alphabetic phases, we would want them to read widely. And we'll talk about what that looks like, as opposed to only reading predictable or leveled text. So we'll talk about the content a bit more deeply. In addition to that, we'll talk about the how this is taught. So people talk about systematic and explicit and sequential. Well, systematic, there's a system in place, right? Routines and structure and a scope and sequence with which to teach our words. And that's what structured literacy would look like. For example, you would have students read CBC patterns like sip or mop well before you're introducing silent E patterns like in cake or vowel teams, as in the word team. If you were reading and not in a systematic, you might watch what students do and take a look at their errors, and then really just base instruction on their reading errors, which would not be from easier to more complex. So we'll talk about that. Explicit is important as well, which means if I am trying to get my students to understand sounds within words, I would say, eyes on me, watch my mouth, listen as I say the sounds in mop. Everyone say mop, mop. Tap sounds, ah, and that word is mop, right? So I would say it, I would have them watch me, and I would direct that. That differs from raising hands. Oftentimes in classrooms, I actually suggest not to raise hands, but to certainly get kids to think, pair, and share, and become much more active in their learning. So this is very different. What structured literacy would not support, and it's not, is, well, raise your hand if you know the sounds in mop. Andrea, do you know? Right? And everyone else gets to kind of opt out. We also want to talk about feedback. I love what Pat Lindenwood used to teach me when she would say, respond to their response. Think thoughtfully about what students tell you and then respond appropriately. So that direct, immediate feedback. When children confuse letter name, letter sounds, which happens often in kindergarten and first grade, if I ask, what's the sound, the first sound in the word mop, and they say M, then I label what it is. That's the letter's name. Tell me the sound it spells. What that does not sound like is, well, if I take papers home, correct spelling or correct their reading mistakes, and then give it to them the next day, there's too much time and it's not direct nor explicit instruction that is helpful at the time. And I'll talk about a little circuitous way in which to teach, test, and teach. Always checking, teach something and then check to make sure that we know that students understand it, and then use that information to inform how we move forward with what we do next in structured literacy. And that's not, here's a list of words to study on Monday, and then we're going to test them on Friday. So I'm going to use this to dig a little bit deeper into some of these aspects of what I consider to be structured literacy. We'll start first with this content. I always have to talk about the brain, so here it is. We talk about the brain and the importance of what we know about good reading for structured literacy. There is not one, two, nor even three, but there are four distinctly different regions in our brain that actually have blood flow gravitate to those areas of the brain. It means that those areas are active with good readers. Those need to be individually accurate and automatic, and they also collectively need to communicate to each other. So when we talk about structured literacy and best practices, I think about the idea that toward the frontal lobe in our left hemisphere, this pronunciation articulation area houses the awareness of 44 phonemes or speech sounds, right? Those 44 phonemes, as many of us who have been studying structured literacy might know, have to connect and be represented by 26 letters. We don't have 44 letters, nor 26 sounds. So we have this conundrum here of having to use 26 letters to represent our phonemes, the phonemes in the English language, 18 of which are really difficult vowel phonemes. So because those are quite far apart in our brains, we talk about that superhighway, as you note down here. I like to call it a superhighway, where we need to make sure that in the very beginning phases of reading, students are aware of sounds, and they're also aware of how to hook that to the letter and letter pattern. They know the name of the letter, and structured literacy also would have them be phonemically aware. And then you're explaining, oh, this is the letter S. We happen to spell it, or spell the sound S with this letter S. Or here's the sound S, and we spell that with the letter S. We represent that with the letter S, which is very different from saying S says S, because letters don't say anything, right? But we're going to be very explicit in explaining how that connection occurs. So that superhighway of communicating back and forth very quickly is what it is that we want our students to do at the very beginning phases. We'll talk about what happens later in just a moment. Okay, so if we think about that and we think about possum, right? And we understand the layers of language, let's think about, we're going to use the word brought and Charles Perfetti's understanding of that deep lexical quality to talk about what we can teach in a structured literacy lesson to get that word embedded within students' memories. Well, brought has the syllables, doesn't it? Like phonemically or phonologically, we can say brought, one syllable. In addition to that, though, it has b, r, ah, t, 4 phonemes. It also has, well, lots of letters, doesn't it? B, R, O, U, G, H, T. Well, there's 7. However, we take those and call them graphemes to represent those phonemes. And in brought, there are 1, 2, 3, only 4 graphemes because they represent the individual phonemes. 4 phonemes, 4 graphemes. It's always a one-to-one correspondence here. And you'll notice that that O-U-G-H is what's tricky in that word. And we would tell students that because it's an older word. Likely it used to be pronounced bracht with that little guttural spit, right? Pardon me for spitting all over you. But that ach really is representing that O sound. Everything else is pretty phonetic. We think about morphemes, no prefixes, no suffixes, there's nothing to pull apart. Brought is that base word, right? With one meaning, it's the past tense of bring, that's our semantics, right? To move something somewhere. And in the syntactical world, it has the job of being the verb. It's an action. So if I were to think about this in relationship to our brain, which I always like to connect it to for structured literacy, here's what that would look like. In the front part of our brain, in the phonological frontal area with pronunciation and articulation, we talked about syllables, syllabication, and morphemes, right? Or phonemes, excuse me, the sounds that we have within our words here. So what's most important for the word recognition component in structured language is the phoneme level. We don't spell nor read at the syllable level. We also don't spell nor read at the rhyming level, at onset rhyme level. So to get right to the root of what gets us to the alphabetic principle, we want to work with phoneme awareness. In addition to that, we also take a look at areas that are in the occipital lobe, the letters and letter patterns, and we're going to teach students directly and explicitly that there are graphemes, letter and letter patterns that represent those phonemes, as we mentioned. So we're not going to teach this as a visual memorizing all the 7 letters. We're going to talk about the graphemes that represent those phonemes. And lastly, there's a lot to talk about with meaning. Honestly, you can read a word without knowing the meaning of the word. However, it's difficult, especially if a word has multiple meanings, or definitely if you've never heard, you don't have the phonological form of that word in Broca's area in your frontal lobe. So it is helpful to have the layers of language include meaning. So we have morpheme, semantics, and syntax. When we talk about all of those together, that's a nice deep lexical quality or a structured literacy way in which to introduce words. So if we go back to that 2-step process we were talking about, when we're thinking about how to get words embedded within our brains for word recognition, let's go back to the first step for beginning decoders. That's a receptive process when they're looking at the letters and they have to then go to the sounds. And we see this here with continuous blending as one of the easier applications of structured literacy. We know that from Lene Airy and her colleagues' work when we talk about the idea that an individual initial sound that is a continuant sound, it has lots of airflow, is much easier for students to then blend than it is a stop sound in the beginning. So we use something like that for students who might have difficulty, especially for students that are dyslexic. So if we look at this, we would have them touch each letter and say the sound in continuous blending. And this word would be zap. And you would see that little, for some reason, it's, oh, the computer's not moving in the right way, but hang on just a moment. Here we go. All right, let's see if I can do that one more time. See if those arrows work the way in which I want them. So you have your finger, of course, underneath. Students have their finger underneath. You have them as an educator on top if you're working in a small group. Zap. and zap. There you go. So that would be an important way in which to work with a continuous sound in the very beginning for structured literacy. If students struggle with that, here's another way in which you can do that. You can blend those two sounds or weld those two sounds together by finger under and saying zzz, ah, zap, zap. It's called additive blending. So those are adjustable ways that you can work in order to help beginning readers receptively decode words. Now, if we want to get very strong orthographic mapping potentials, encoding or spelling is extremely helpful and reinforcing to that superhighway in our brain with the same processing systems, because it's an expressive activity where what we need to do is now figure out or express what the letter and letter patterns are for the sounds. So it's a slightly different task, but for structured literacy, we would say the word zap, zap, tap those sounds, z, ah. Nice job. Now we would ask ourselves, what's the first sound in zap? And hopefully our students can say z. What letter or letter pattern do you think of for z? Oh, that's a Z. Go ahead and move your grapheme tile, or go ahead and write that letter within that first Alconin box. Then you would say, this word is zap. Likely because you're thinking about oral language always, think about putting that in a sentence. When you put your finger in a socket, you might zap yourself. Please be careful and not do that. Zap. What's the second sound in zap? Ah. What letter do you think of? A. And there you go. The last sound in zap. What letter do you have in your mind for? And you would have taught them P. So there goes the chip, of course, as we know, for structured literacy and explicit systematic instruction. And then we have zap. And I would ask them, how do you spell zap? Z-A-P, zap. So that would be very explicit, and that would be working, as you can see, at the CVC level. So structured literacy is not looking at the shape of a word, right? We don't know words by how they are visually, because if we have the shape of this word, we could change the S to a C, couldn't we? We could change the A to an I, and we could change the E to an S, and it would be the same shape and a completely different word. So we don't memorize our words by visually putting them into our brains. We map them, we orthographically map them as we're sharing through structured literacy approaches, as you can see here with a sound wall that many of us may have been exposed to as we see workshops, as we work in classrooms, and as we do our readings and attend conferences. So it is not our Travis, they, that, they are together, this, and toy under the letter T, but it is all the phonemes. That's a consonant phoneme chart right here with how the mouth looks, and of course, exemplars. So when we think about that information and knowledge, let's go back to our organizer for just a heartbeat here. And we've talked a little bit about the synthetic phonics and the orthographic mapping part. I want to mention that the second step here, though, is statistical learning. And so people will suggest that not all words need to be coded specifically, even for students that struggle, that once they understand that alphabetic principle and are pretty solid with reading and spelling some basic words. So in Linnea Aries phases, they may have moved into the later alphabetic phase, in beginning to move into the consolidated alphabetic phase, and they have many words as if by sight in their visual word form area. Structured literacy then adjusts or changes. And I'm sometimes reticent to talk about this too soon, because if we go to statistical learning for beginning readers or struggling readers that don't have a lot of progress with the basic orthographic mapping, then it'll be necessary for them just to look at the beginnings of words and guess and start making lots of mistakes. So it is up to us as educators to be really cautious about what it is that we're looking for and when students can move away from those decodable texts into texts that have, well, let's take a look at what kind of text they really would need. So there are books for so many different reasons. Get the Sock. That's a decodable, right? So when we take a look at this, Dad, Jack, and Mac had a nap. Jack and Mac got up. Mac was sad. Mac had no sock. Structured literacy provides lots of explicit practice with exactly what you just taught. This is perfect for the beginning readers that are still working orthographically mapping many of these words and these processes here, these structures. So if students have lots of information and knowledge, then we need to move away from that and improve what it is that we're sharing with them so that they can get more exposure. So here we have Ada to a Scientist. And in those texts, as an example here, you'll see that there is a wide variety of words like learned with a vowel team and an inflected ending, past tense ed. We have climb, which is blend in the beginning, silent letter pattern with that B. It's not climb, but climb, right? Vowel team with break, vowel team with trail. Chaos is interesting, isn't it? Because AO is not a typical vowel team. Left, blend at the end, wake, silent E. We have lots of orthographic patterns now and extended phoneme awareness, not just CVC words in here. So as students have understood their orthographic mapping, have built the visual word form area, and structured literacy has provided that support, now we are going to utilize things like that for statistical learning. And that's a bridge sort of to where we want to go with, well, things like Harry Potter, right? When we're talking about really extending students' ability to work with much richer text with a wider variety so that they can literally work through the words that they don't know and become much more confident in approximately 1 to 4 exposures, depending on the student, but that's the typical exposure in order to map words. So when we think about that here, when we see ignore the quill, Harry, said Rita Skeeter firmly. Reluctantly, Harry looked up at her instead. Now, why did you decide to enter the tournament, Harry? And there's a lot in there, well beyond what it is that we would ask our beginning readers, of course, to read. So when we think of statistical learning, and we are trying to make sure that children are exposed to words well beyond just those decodables when they're ready and they understand that, there's an important distinction and support that we want to provide for them. Otherwise, they'll be perfect practice makes perfect, and they'll be practicing making mistakes. We don't want that. So let me share that, well, here's the one and only Ivan. And I'm going to pop over here to my document camera. So if I'm looking at this text and my student is reading and I'm working along with them, what I might do if I'm working in a structured literacy situation is to be much more explicit and systematic in how it is that I provide feedback in here. But I want my students to be exposed to words beyond what they already know. So if I have this sense or my student is reading, come on, Ruby, Mac is almost pleading. What is your problem? She's excited, I say to myself, that's the problem. So the student said, she's excited, I say to myself, right? So if the student says she's excited, immediately on the spot, I have to decide as an educator, if I'm working carefully here, providing this feedback, what should I expect my students to know and be able to do? What have I taught explicitly in the scope and sequence? What did they get right about this word? And where should I go after this word in order to help them know that that's not excited, that's exhausted. So the part of the word that they did get right is the X. That's the prefix, right? They also got the suffix correct, didn't they? The ED, exhausted. And it's the middle of the word here, excited, exhausted, that they got wrong, which makes sense because if we know from our phonological memory, the beginning of the word is the easiest, the end of the word tends to be a little trickier, and that middle of the word is the most difficult of all, right in here. So what I would say is I would find something that the student did really well. Nice job. You read that prefix and suffix really nicely. See, that's the morphology layer of language that we want to bring out in structured literacy, right? And then we'd want to say, take a look. You said excited. Say that word, excited. Let's now compare that. Let's see if this says excited. XOO. Okay, so my student would then, I would say, put your finger on under the word and blend through. What does that word really say? Exhausted. Oh, exhausted. Nice job. And then I would ask, now please go to the beginning of the sentence and read through that sentence. And this time for this word, what are you going to say? Exhausted. She's exhausted, I say to myself. That's the problem. So that type of explicit feedback, we talked about the word explicit in our little organizer here, is extremely important at the time when we're ready for our students to have enough sight word recognition and an understanding of the code to be able to learn statistically and be exposed to books that have words they may not know. So with that in mind, right, because there's the criticism that we stay too long in decodables without helping our students understand words and work through words beyond. So let's go back to our organizer for just a moment and take stock of where we are. We talked about possum and we talked about Perfetti's deep lexical quality. That's definitely part of explicit structured literacy. We also talked about the idea that we are teaching synthetic phonics. We're not memorizing words by heart. We're not looking at how tall or short a letter is, of course, but we are orthographically mapping from different places within our brain explicitly and systematically. And we are learning statistically once we have moved closer to later into consolidated alphabetic phases here. So we've talked about possum, talked about synthetic phonics. We've also embedded a little bit of explicit instruction, didn't we? We talked about tap, tap, tapping, moving things, discussing how to put those graphemes in for the phonemes. And we talked about the conversation to utilize when students make a little bit of a mistake explicitly. We then talked a little bit about that direct immediate feedback, of course, with things like exhausted when students make mistakes. So where should we go next? Let's look at that word systematic. The word system is in there. So structured literacy includes systematic instruction. We talked about how we read or spell words that are easier before those that are a little more difficult. So here's my challenge. We talk about the idea that we move through a scope and sequence that is extremely driven by a predetermined scope and sequence from easier to more complex, and not determined by random mistakes. For instance, if my student were reading that text and made the mistake with excited, exhausted, I wouldn't then talk about instructing them on how to spell or read excited and how to spell or read exhausted, right? That wouldn't be where I would go. So as we think about where we may be in our curriculum here, the C or the V stands, well, it can stand for sounds. It could also stand for letter and letter patterns here. In this sample right in here, I'd like you to think about sample words that exemplify the patterns that you see here. We have a C. Do we have words that just have a consonant sound in them? If these stand for sounds, we don't really, do we, right? V. Well, wait a minute. Do we have words that just have one phoneme in them? Well, sure we do. What about I? Like I am excited to be with you tonight in California, this afternoon for you in California. Or I have an eyelash in my eye, right? That I as well. One phoneme and it's a vowel. If we had words with two sounds, vowel, consonant, take a moment and jot down. What are some example words? Or can you think of a word that has consonant vowel patterns? We always talk about CVC, right? That commonly gets discussed. I even use the word zap to think about, or zip to think about CVC patterns. Take a moment and see, can you come up with a word that has a blend in the beginning, a blend in the end? And then look at this. What about words that have blends in the beginning and in the end? That's different. Even though we've already talked about explicit and systematic, we've talked about orthographically mapping, it matters how many phonemes we have in words. So we want to be systematic in how we go through this logical scope and sequence. You don't want to teach a word with a blend before you really have worked with some of the other layers of phoneme awareness. And those blends, of course, may have two sounds, or we see down here with CCC, 3 phonemes. And then we see blends in the end, in that very end piece. So if I take away, I have to end the show for just a heartbeat to take away that box here, excuse me for a minute. And as I take away that box and I look at my sample words, hopefully you had an opportunity maybe to write a few for yourself. Let's see what we have. And I'll show you the method behind my madness in the words that I shared. So of course we have nothing for consonants, as we said, and the I and the N are pretty obvious. but these are written in order of complexity. So not only does it matter that we have 2 sounds, then 3 sounds, and 4 phonemes as we build moving forward, but the types of phonemes that we're representing here and the graphemes we use matter. Map is pretty straightforward. The A is not distorted at all phonemically. Is a continuant. That's really nice. And it's not distorting that vowel because it comes before and not after. As educators, I often think we often choose a word like ship as a CCVC. Why did I put that in a CVC pattern? Well, right, because we're talking about phonemes. Say ship, ship, tap sounds. Sh, p, ship, 3 phonemes. So that first pattern is a digraph. Orthographically, that makes it more difficult than a word like map. So if I'm thinking about my instruction, I want to be sure to be thoughtful about what I introduce when I introduce that. Same thing for judge. There are a lot of letters there, but only 3 phonemes. If I look at the blend in the beginning for flat, is a nice continuant sound and that works. Stop is problematic because that middle sound is a stop sound. And what that means here is that it doesn't last very long. And it also deaspirates or loses its push of air as the second sound in a blend. It almost feels like a D. Trip and drain have what we call allophonic variations that are very severe. It almost sounds like ch and j in those words. So while I want to use those with a blend in the beginning, I won't do that right away because they're so difficult. See how tricky the sequential part, the systematic sequential scope and sequence becomes? The more you know about language, the more we know we can fine tune and provide our examples appropriately. Mist is easier with a blend at the end. Shops now has that digraph in the beginning, still one sound, and that is a stop sound. What happens to the vowel sound in sand when we're asking our students to be aware of the sounds and eventually spell it? Well, it nasalizes it because there's a nasal under there. After there, same like shrimp, nasal after the a and slant, and those are problematic, right? So each of these words that I chose, that you'll get to reference it a little bit, in your PDFs of my slides, go from easier to more complex. I just want us to think about that when we choose our samples, because teachers really teach students, right? Not programs. Now, if we think about common patterns, we're going to choose some of our short vowel phonemes. We're going to choose some of the common consonant phonemes for beginning and ending sounds. And what we start to do in our scope and sequence for that systematic part of structured literacy is to choose something that has a continuant in the front and not a non-distorted vowel sound. So we have our zap, and we're going to be very explicit and structured in how we work that through as we work with saying the word, tapping or moving chips, z, a, and of course, spelling it as we move each of those phonemes as we did before. It's not okay just to stay there. So of course, we want to go to blends in the beginning, blends in the end. So here we have words like flap or camp, which has a distorted vowel sound. You have to get there eventually, right? And help students feel their noses. And shrimp, which by the way, that's a sh, r, I, 5 phonemes, double blend in the, blend with 2 sounds in the beginning, or blend with 2 sounds at the end. So we would have them tap those and of course map them so that they understand that sound symbol connection back and forth in explicit instruction. Just like that. So we've talked about systematic. Now let's just do, as our last point here, as we finish our time together, let's look at the teach, test, teach, right? So let's take a look here and see if the student, if they learned what you had taught here. So if you've taught all these patterns and you have a spelling inventory here, you might notice that the student, well, what do you notice? Fan is F-O-N. Mob has a BD confusion. Rope has that P backward. Weight is an A. And now I notice chunk and sled and stick. Stick, nice job. All sounds are there. Shine, it's confusion with shine. There's a little blend here with dream. blade, coach, that's 3 sounds, fright, snowing. As you get more extensive with the sounds here, they drop out the number of phonemes that you have, and they start confusing some of the phonemes, like camping, right? That now that morphemic level right in here, layer of language, is lost with the ing. So where would you begin? And why would you begin there as we think about our scope and sequence here? So I'll finish the conversation just to have, because I realize our time is getting so short right in here. The idea that when we think about where to begin for instruction and intervention, I take a look at, well, things like cleaning up that vowel phoneme with than, ah, right? That phoneme level. We think for structured literacy, the idea of the orthographic pattern of the silent E and the vowel team AI. And phonemically, we really want to go after that nasal, that in chunk, that's missing. The that second sound in that blend here in sled, that's also missing. So what would we do? If we are in a structured literacy environment, we would think if that's all had been taught and the students didn't learn it, you go back right there, right? And you would teach that extremely explicitly, very much so in a speech to print pattern, where you'd phonemically make sure they're aware of the sounds. And then we would make sure that we can tap those and map them in our phoneme graphing mapping. These examples of slap, flot, and mobs would be perfect. And after that type of work, of course, this is exactly what that student did. That's a real life student with their spelling inventory, and after working with phonemes explicitly in a structured literacy environment, this is what they can do. So blot with the L, blob with the L, blush with the L, hadn't done that before. Send and sand included the N. Nice job. All right. So I do know, Jessica and Deidre, my time is kind of up here and I'm supposed to stop. Just to kind
No,
of
please continue. If you have more content, that's fine. And we can ask questions, kind of closer
Great.
into the end, but we'd love to hear what you have to say.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So as we work through thinking about how well that student really responded to the instruction, the important part of the structured literacy was tapping those sounds, being aware of how to represent those with the phonemes, then representing the phonemes with the graphemes in a very much a speech to print fashion. One last thing to think about before we talk about any clarifications you may have is when we think about articulatory gestures or what's behind phoneme awareness. Phonemes, well, there's lots behind phonemes. A phoneme is not one thing. A sound, a phoneme or a speech sound is a combination of the way in which we move our articulatory features. So what do we do with our tongue, with our airflow, with our teeth? What's going on with our lips and our voicing in here? So, or our nasal, our nose sounds right in here. So one of the things I appreciate being able to do is to take a look at how we code or work through the differences within phonemes. So I'll finish our time together just kind of thinking about the phonemes of our language. Remember, there are how many phonemes in the English language? 44. When we think of those 44, we think of the vowels, there's a particular difficulty. Vowels are, well, let's explore that for just a minute here as we finish our time. So when we sort these vowel phonemes, let's think about airflow. The further apart a sound is, or the more different a sound is, the easier it is to differentiate. Think about the color black versus the color purple, right? Those sometimes can be a little similar, right? Or blush, kind of to pink. Those are extremely similar. And then think about gray and white, how different they really are, right? So if you think about sounds, in some ways, it's kind of like that, where sounds that are similar, they have overlapping articulatory features, are hard to differentiate. Is that really pink? Is that rose? I'm not really sure what that color is. I'm not really sure what that sound is, right? And how you differentiate from each other. But if they're very different from each other, it's easier for them, it's for us to be able to identify and understand. So with that in mind, if we think about what's happening with our phonemes, I have the vowel phonemes here, and this is a little Jamboard I'll give you the link to so that you can play with this yourself if you'd like. here, but one aspect of phonemes and articulatory gesture, the way in which we make them, has to do with airflow. Let me ask you, with the airflow in, say, O, here's our long vowel sound, O. Everyone say that sound. O. That's a continuant, isn't it? The airflow can go on forever and ever. So we'll put it over here to the left. That means the airflow goes forever. What about this one? Likely you're saying, ah, and that airflow goes forever. Oi. I can make that one go forever. What's going on here? That one's going forever too. Well, all of these have lots of airflow. If we're really articulating these accurately, they last for a long time. This is what that means. Or, ow. Continuance. There are no stops in the vowels, right? As a matter of fact, the whole reason that we call vowels vowels, and vowels are sounds, by the way, not letters, is that we have an open, unobstructed airflow, and vowel comes from the Latin word vocal. So when a vowel, we are very vocal in how we say them. They are all continuants. They carry the sound within our syllables, and they all happen to have another characteristic we'll talk about in a heartbeat here. But because the airflow is all continuant and there are no stop sounds, it's hard to differentiate vowels, isn't it? I can't feel the difference between my airflow because they all are the same. Let me ask you that about voicing. Let's see. Take your hand, put it on your throat, and I would wonder, challenge us to find a vowel phoneme that is unvoiced. Ooh. No, that's voiced. Oi. Yeah. Ah. I bet you're on to me. Every vowel sound is voiced. And that's because of the vocality, right, of those sounds. So what that means, again, is that vowel phonemes are difficult to differentiate from each other. So when we're teaching in a structured literacy system, we have to account for the scope and sequence of what we're teaching, right? How difficult it is in an orthographic manner, but then also how difficult this is in a phonological or a phonemic manner. And we would introduce our students to the idea that sounds that are alike or very similar, we'd want to work a lot with sound chains to be able to help them feel and see, as well as hear, the differences between those. That's when some of our dyslexics get really tripped up. And that's what really good instruction that is explicit and systematic really can do to help make sure students get that hardwired really solidly here in orthographically mapping our words. So I'll stop there just for a heartbeat. I know we just have about 7 minutes left there, Jessica.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Tolman, for that amazing presentation, so packed with information. And we do have some time for questions. Just before we do that, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen briefly so that we can share the webinar survey link.
Absolutely.
But then, yes, we do have time for a few questions, and we got some great ones in there as well. So we will share it. And you know what? I just put the link in the chat. So if you want, you can close down your, you can actually close it down so we can see you during the Q&A. That works fine.
Oh, okay, great.
And I've added it to the chat. So the first question that came through that I would like to ask is from a participant. She said, there are so many different scopes and sequences out there. Based on the learning today and the importance of deep analysis beyond just the pattern and including phonology and simple and complex, even within a pattern, do you suggest a specific scope and sequence that people should use, or one that includes these critical points you're sharing? Which one would you recommend?
Great, thank you. Well, there's no research that will say there's one scope and sequence that's the ideal over another. It is the general premise, and that's true for structured literacy, that there's a scope and sequence where skills are taught from easier to more complex, and that's very specific when students are learning the code, they haven't orthographically mapped lots of words yet, so they don't have lots of sight words in here. So beginner readers and beginning spellers. But I would say this, look for a scope and sequence that in general goes from easier to more complex. They won't, I just looked at a great program today, and I was noticing that one of the chains, I was questioning why they chose certain words, because I noticed that there was an allophonic variant that distorted the sounds early on in the very beginning of the lesson. And so within that knowledge base, I went, but this is what I came to understand and think about, that their general scope and sequence was very solid. Lots of the program was great. No program is perfect, but that scope and sequence could work. And I, as a teacher, and you with your knowledge base as teachers, can then be smarter than that program, teach. And some children, especially those that have solid phoneme awareness, or at least average phoneme awareness, will be just fine. They can deal with those difficulties. And students that struggle with phoneme awareness, and especially typically our dyslexic students, won't be. They will struggle. So those are the children we take in small groups, and then we adjust the sample words that we would utilize in order to teach certain skills. Once we start trying to dissect a program and its scope and sequence, it's particularly difficult because so many pieces of the puzzle depend on each other. For instance, imagine the decodable practice, which is extremely important in the beginning phases of reading. If you are changing the way in which you teach that scope and sequence, your decodables no longer match, do they? Right? So now you're going to be asking students, if you teach short A, then short I, but the decodable considers you've taught short A and then short E, then the decodable isn't going to match, and you won't have the practice that you need, and you'll kind of get stuck. So again, from easier to more complex, keep in mind these difficulties, watch your children. That's where that I love teach, test, teach, right? Just ask those ideas, think about that in a circular way, and that will really help you watch how students respond, and you can adjust some of the examples appropriately. That's what I'd say.
Wonderful. I think we have time for about one more question. And we got one early on that said, it seems like there are so many different structured literacy training programs available. What should administrators look for if they are looking for professional development for their staff?
Great. Okay. So I think, first of all, I guess you would want to know what your staff knows and what they have done, of course, for professional development, and what your student data is showing you, so that you would understand where your teachers are and where they need to know and go, in their knowledge base. Because there are so many, if you're interested in structured literacy supports and information and professional development, you would look for someone that's clearly representing all those layers of language, right? So you're looking for someone who's talking about phoneme awareness and orthography. Remember that possum, right? So think about semantics, think about syntax, think about morphology, and ensure that all of those layers of language are melded in there with, of course, you can go right back to that chart that I shared, thinking about how explicit it needs to be, how systematic it needs to be. Of course, that teach, test, teach cycle, if all of those items are in there, and people present that in a very engaging, informative way with lots of modeling. And I would also say that professional development coupled, as we know from Joyce and Flowers research, coupled with coaching is the best way in which to do that. And so you don't want someone coming to just tell you, you want to learn information so that you have some background knowledge with which to think. You want to practice, and then you want someone to help coach you within the classroom with the practices that you've been shared. So that's what I would look for and recommend.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Tolman. That's all that we have time for today, but we want to thank you for your time on behalf of Glean Education and the Sacramento County Office of Education and the California Dyslexia Initiative. And thank you to our wonderful attendees who take their time after their long day to sit and learn with us. We look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar with Joan Sedita on teaching writing in a structured literacy approach. She's fantastic. So that'll be really fun. That's on May 11th, 2023. Please register for that event. We'll put the link in the chat. And thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Tolman.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. you got that registration in there. Okay.
Yeah, put that in. So stop recording.